Welcome to the College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Here's Shehan and Bobak Hayeri.
Hey everybody, it's the College Football Survivor Show. I'm Bobak Hayeri with my co-host Shehan Raja, national college football writer for CBS Sports. We are glad to have you with us. Week 2 is behind us. The storylines are starting to emerge. The biggest macro level takeaways, this is going to be a fun, wide-ranging discussion all year on who's actually going to make that first 12-team playoff field. We've got stuff to talk about, a team to vote off, as we have to do, as well as possibly one team to vote on. The results of the weekend, we'll take a look at those, as well as who we think appears to have pure championship ability after 2 weeks. But before we dive into all of this, let me remind you, you can find us on X and TikTok at CFB Survivor Show, where we have video highlights of the show, run polls, and listen to your feedback. Please take a moment, if you can, to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. But before we dive into this, just going to do a quick reminder, because we tweaked the format this season with the 12-team playoff. So we have a maximum, one of those days, right? A maximum of 12 teams that are in our survivor pool. Each week, we must vote off one team. I guess, can we vote off more than one, Sean? I'm actually not sure about that.
We can. We absolutely can.
We may not, but we could. But yes. So if all the teams win, like last week, it gets a little trickier. We ended up booting off Oregon because we weren't exactly impressed by that Idaho performance, and maybe that game against Boise State's a whole other question. But anyways, after we vote a team off, we can vote on teams to replace them, up to 12 teams to fill up the island again, so to speak. So the other requirements for 2024 and the 12-team playoff is we have to have at least one team from each P4 conference, because one of those teams is going to be a lock each season, as well as a fifth G5 team, presumably a G5 champion. It has to be a G5 champion, which we'll also look in. So if any of those get eliminated, if we lose the last ACC team, we have to put in an ACC team. If we lose a G5 team, we have to put in a G5 team. So again, it's pretty straightforward. So we'll keep a good static 12-team number with representatives from all the major conferences. So all of that said, a really quick rundown of our teams that we had going into this last weekend: Georgia, Texas, Ohio State, Alabama, Ole Miss, Mizzou, Notre Dame, Penn State, Miami, Florida, USC, Utah, and our G5 team was Boise State. Okay, we put it all back on the stage. Shehan, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Yeah, like you said, it's kind of a real-time look at how the playoff might look, except with the idea that we just throw a bomb in there just for no reason once a week to kick somebody off. And look, like you said, last week, we decided to go bold with it. I actually think that our boldness was rewarded in some ways after the game that was played last week. And the other piece, too, is that, again, we got to look at it from the perspective of a G5 team has to be in, right? Like one of the 4 power champions has to be in every single year. So this was a fascinating week for that reason, because actually 2 teams on our list did lose games. But I think that it was a little obvious to me which one of them had to be kicked off.
Oh, poor Boise State. No, okay. So, this was an interesting one, because as we said, both of us had, and basically everyone had penciled in a Boise State loss at Oregon that would not necessarily ruin their chances for being the G5 champion or the G5 present one.
And I'll tell you what, this was kind of a best case scenario for a loss for Boise State. Not just because they kept it close, but because they clearly showed that they can hang. Right? Like the worry for me was that the G5 teams would get, well, I was going to say get Liberty, but we can also say now would get App Stated. App State, you're done. You're not going to be considered after the way that she played against Clemson University on Saturday. But if you're able to hang, if you're able to give yourself a chance, I think that's fine. Right. And no matter what happens the rest of the way, Boise State is going to have a game where, frankly, they outplayed Oregon. where, which again, by the end of the year, Oregon is not in our list of contenders now. I will say now, actually, we put them up for a vote this week, and we'll have a chance to overturn your verdict if we so decide. But the voters on our Twitter account did not agree. They decided that Oregon should, in fact, still not be part of our list of contenders, which I'll tell you was a little surprising to me. They were rejected with 76.5% of the votes. We will have a chance to vote in a team. There was one other that we had up for consideration that we will talk about in a few minutes. But I think that Boise State, to me, I didn't include them on our list to be voted out because I don't think that anyone else in the G5 has done anything to the level of nearly beat Oregon to this point.
It's an interesting point you've made, because I think now that we're looking at Notre Dame and whether or not they should stay on or not,
that's also a fair point, by the way. Just to preface, there was a G5 team that did something.
I was about to say, NIU may have a case now, but the problem is they came in with zero expectations. Before the show, I was talking with our producer Joey Alberti, and I said, like, were they even expected to do well? And before the show, I looked it up. They were tied for third in the preseason MAC poll with Bowling Green team that challenged Penn State. Penn State is the biggest winner this week because all the attention went to Notre Dame. Like they had a first half that was just a kind of a mess. And then especially for their defense. And then suddenly they got it together and were able to come from behind against those wily Falcons. But going back to this, so we have both of them were tied. Behind, the only first place votes went to Miami of Ohio, which was number one, and then Toledo, which is a perennial power in the MAC, although they've lost a couple of key players, as we've talked about in the portal season. So here we have NIU, who decided to go to, they had a strong opener against Western Illinois, but that's a pretty bad FCS team. In fact, they got blown out again by another team this past week. But then they go to Notre Dame Stadium. They're not intimidated. They play a physical brand of football. I know Coach Tom Hammock said that they front-loaded their week with more intense practices so that they would have time for the players' bodies to recover in time for Saturday. And it worked because they looked great in the trenches. They outgained Notre Dame by over 100 yards. And they were able to get the ball going. And they actually had great special teams, too, with those blocked field goals. Notre Dame just looked off. And I think all of that is part of it is like, so are we saying Notre Dame was weaker, or are we saying especially after the Texas A&M win, are we suddenly flipping that script on them, or was NIU good? And I mean, Oregon is fascinating right now because they're 2-0 and have managed to almost drop out of the top 10. They were number 3. Now they're number 9 in the latest AP poll. And if they keep playing games this way, they probably will drop out of the top 10. They're going to be one of those teams that we see from time to time that keep winning, but everyone's just sort of looking at their watch and counting down the days until they're going to finally meet someone who's going to crush them. In this case, that Ohio State game looks a lot more ominous than it did before the season. But I think that's a big question now, Shehan. Is Notre Dame that much worse than Oregon, or to be fair, the Boise State, I was critical of them a little bit last week because that Georgia Southern team is good, but that game should not. And I think that's what shocked me the most. I truly expected this game to be like, 60-36 or something like that. Boise State would put some points on the board, but Oregon will put way more on the board. I did not expect this to end on a walk-off field goal by the Ducks.
So I do think that there's a couple things that factor into this for me. One, I'm willing to write off Boise State's Week 1 performance as, again, a look-ahead spot, like we kind of talked about with Texas State against UTSA. And so I didn't concern myself too much. I thought that they were probably playing very vanilla, not to give anything away to Oregon in Week 2, because they knew that they could just put that game away whenever they wanted to. The other thing, too, when it comes to Notre Dame has a history of this, right? Notre Dame has a history of just flopping in some big spots. I believe they lost to Stanford 16-14 back in 2022.
That same season was the Marshall loss, too.
Yep, and I was going to say, that same season, they lost to Marshall. And Marshall won 9 games, but only finished 5-3 in MAC play. So, I mean, this is actually a quick aside. This is always one of the more entertaining things to me about the rankings. And I do love this. I have no problem with this. I love the fact that this happens because I think that it's just like Northern Illinois getting ranked is great. I love it. I don't think it actually is going to last, but like I love that they get the opportunity to be ranked. But I think that we like adjust so much to this idea of like, oh, well, hey, Georgia Tech, they beat Florida State when they were number 10. Georgia Tech must be good. And then they lose to Syracuse the very next week because they're not actually good. Florida State's just bad. So I think I think this is all something that makes me a little, I guess, on the fence about how much do we credit Northern Illinois. Because like, Notre Dame has had these letdown spots before. They just lose these games that they have no business losing, season after season in some ways. And so I some of it is internal bias of how I projected these teams coming into the year, certainly. But and if I'll tell you what, if Northern Illinois makes it to 13-0 with a win over Notre Dame, like I think that they get in. I think that would be enough. I think even if they got to 12-1, but still win the MAC and have that win over Notre Dame, they might be okay, right? Like they'll have another chance in a couple weeks actually to play NC State, who's a team that will not be making our list of contenders anytime soon after what happened against Tennessee. But that's another big opportunity. If they either win that game or play them really close and lose really close, I think that this is a very serious conversation to be had about whether NIU.
I just want to say
over.
This seems to be a perfect scenario for NIU because Notre Dame, as we talked about, has a pretty weak schedule this season, and they could very well, this could be an aberration. They could keep winning, which is only going to help NIU if they keep winning. And I was looking at NIU's schedule. They get a bye week now. They're hosting Buffalo. Boy, is that going to be exciting in DeKalb. And then they head out to NC State. I love this game because the stories that'll be written, assuming they beat Buffalo, are going to be, no matter how NC State does, are going to be fantastic. Because the head coach of NC State, David Dorian, he made his bones at NIU. He was there for only 2 seasons.
Jordan Lynch's coach, right?
Back-to-back MAC titles, and then he gets that incredible. Well, it was a 12-1 regular season. They lost the opener in Iowa. As Iowa, we've talked. Maybe we'll talk briefly about the Cyhawk game, but they lose to Iowa. They win the next 12 games. He takes a job at NC State right before they go and play the Orange Bowl. They were outclassed pretty badly by Florida State, but that was a weird G5 year in general. So the fact is, he's going to be playing his old team, who is looking to potentially break into the playoff. I mean, the game, it's going to all right itself. And if Notre Dame keeps winning, it's only going to sweeten them up. NC State, not sure how they're going to do. We'll probably talk about how that Tennessee game went a little bit later. But all that said, the MAC schedule is interesting. They're going to have to play all the major 4 contenders. I mean, the other 3 major contenders. They're going to be playing at Bowling Green on October 12th. They're going to be hosting Toledo, which is going to be an interesting game on the 19th because Toledo plays Mississippi State this weekend. That's going to be one that'll establish them as whether they're not also a potential contender, because usually we were talking a little bit about Toledo potentially being a MAC contender. And then finally, in a perfect MAC game on Tuesday in November, they're going to be playing at Miami of Ohio in a game that might eventually be the question mark before they perhaps have a chance to break in. But all of that is to say, can we go back to Notre Dame for a second? Are they our team? A pretty much unanimous decision that we're going to be pushing them off the island.
Yeah. And I think that the more interesting question for them, and we wrote about it a little bit at cbssports.com on Monday, and I took the against view because I'm not all the way there, but I think that it's a really interesting perspective. Can Notre Dame still make the playoff after this loss? And look, they can go 11-1. They will have a game against USC that should be pretty good. But like Texas A&M is already out of the rankings and they haven't looked awesome so far. You have a game against Florida State that was supposed to be your top 10 victory. and Florida State's a disaster. Louisville's interesting, but if Louisville loses to Notre Dame, I don't know that they stay in the rankings necessarily. And so you're really betting your entire season on the idea that, one, you can go on the road and beat USC, which you might not be able to do, and two, that USC is good enough that they probably have to be a team that's still in the playoff with a loss to you. So, like, I don't think that Notre Dame is making the playoff this year. They had the easiest, most straightforward path imaginable, and then they lost a game to, again, a team that might be good in the MAC. We don't know this as yet. Like, there's still better teams potentially in the MAC. So, like, potentially a non-champion MAC team. By the way, Notre Dame was the first top 5 team to ever lose to a MAC team. They were 0-51 heading into this game. Like, that is a black mark that I don't think that you can really compare to anything in history. And again, when you combine the loss itself with some of the structural flaws that they showed over these first 2 weeks, with a schedule that I don't think is going to give them enough in terms of quality wins, but can certainly give them something in terms of losses, with teams like Georgia Tech on it, with teams like Florida State on it, with teams, I mean, again, they lost to Stanford a couple of years ago, and Stanford's kind of fun now. Like, I don't know. I think that Notre Dame is not making the college football playoff. What say you?
I just have to say, you know, you're saying it might not even be the best MAC team. Well, in 2 weeks, the funniest thing could happen, because Miami of Ohio also goes to Notre Dame Stadium.
Oh,
and
no.
Could you imagine the preseason #1 goes in? Oh, I'm pretty sure the Irish are not going to be caught asleep playing that particular team to get their revenge on the MAC conference. But oh man, that would pretty much end everything so fast. And and I think that's the thing. It kind of goes to this whole Marcus Freeman year 3 thing. I mean, first year losing to Marshall and that bad Stanford team were somewhat more like, okay, he's. I mean, the whole question of whether he was ready to be the head coach was a side story. I mean, he's learning on the job, okay, but third season with all those expectations, with a new quarterback from the ACC who again does not quite look like what they were hoping he would be. We'll see. Again, things can turn around. We said it for Florida State before they lost again. It is still, and hey, Florida State could still be in this. You know, Notre Dame, if you win out, it's certainly possible. But ironically enough, my first thought was, you know, they're playing the wrong Miami this season if they actually do want to get back into the race. They should have been playing the other Miami. But you know, at this point, let's just beat the MAC Miami and then we'll talk. All right, so Notre Dame, you're off. We'll get done talking about you for a little bit. It's probably going to be a few games until we'll really get a chance to talk about you again, because you got to beat some teams. You got to beat some real teams, and then maybe some other teams got to lose before you're going to become part of this conversation. I know you didn't put them in the teams to potentially remove, but could we just briefly go back to Boise State for a second? Should we keep them in, or should we consider swapping them with an NIU?
It's a fair question. It's a totally fair question. Like you said, we have never walked away from being reactionary before, right? Like we are willing to do stuff like that. It's a fair point, right? Like we obviously,
who's got an easier conference right now? The MAC seems like a more reasonably winnable thing. And while Air Force fell exactly as you predicted, the San Jose State put that whole like, oh no, they reloaded, and you're like, no, they need a few years to get used to that. The Air Force gets strong every couple of years. They don't get strong immediately after they lose all those seniors. And San Jose State put that to rest. But again, Ashton G&T had a phenomenal day against the Ducks. So I'm not saying he's not a great player, but my concern is UNLV. Like they are, and we've talked about them before, but they are looking downright scary out there with what they've been producing on the field. And I believe they head to Kansas. Kansas is coming off that loss to Illinois. Again, they're still theoretically in it because that is a pretty open Big 12, but suddenly I'm looking at UNLV and I'm worried about, you know, I believe because again, they lost Jaden Mayava to USC at an amazing fourth quarter touchdown in that Utah State game where he kind of looked a bit like Caleb Williams for a second. But Matthew Sluka and Ricky White connected for 3 different first quarter touchdowns in a blowout over Utah Tech. But, you know, again, the UNLV looks angry and good. Now I'm wondering if Boise State will be able to make it through if they have another game where their defense can't quite keep up with their offense?
Yeah, it is an interesting question. Now, I think you also have to factor in, again, NIU does go to play at NC State on September 28th. That might be the best individual opponent left that any of these teams play. Like, that's going to be a tough game. The UNLV game, like you said, definitely one to keep an eye on. Now, I'll ask you this too. So, Boise State loses on a last second field goal on the road against a team that we are pretty sure is eventually going to be in the college football playoff. Can they sustain a second loss and still be in it? Whereas, like let's just assume that NIU loses at NC State. Like, let's just assume, but then goes 12-1. Which of these two schedules is going to be valued more? Because it's not just the really good Mountain West schedule that you're talking about, where you go to UNLV, where, look, I think that the rest of the schedule is pretty manageable overall. San Diego State, I think, is going to be an okay team. Wyoming looks kind of bad. I don't know. But the other thing that you have to look at, they get both Washington State and Oregon State, both of whom have looked kind of good so far. I think that these will be two wins that are considered. I'm not saying that they'll be considered power conference wins, but I think that they're right on the edge of that. If you're talking about an 11-2, and let's just say, for argument's sake, like, oh, they lose a weird one against San Diego State, but then they beat all of Washington State, UNLV, Oregon State, and let's say UNLV a second time in the conference title game. Is that better than beating Notre Dame, losing to NC State, playing that Miami, Ohio game is real, right? And they play Toledo at home too. I think that they would earn it quite a bit if they did win this conference, but I don't know. Where do you kind of feel on that?
Well, I'll say this much. San Diego State's, like, in a late game, got shut out by Oregon State. So suddenly they're looking a lot less attractive right now than I think a lot of people thought going into the season, giving a lot of hope on Sean Lewis. I think he's got a little bit bigger of a thing to build up there. With Washington State and Oregon State, I agree. Those would be decent victories. They would be stronger than probably any MAC team, unless, maybe Toledo could, Toledo beats Mississippi State, we'll talk. But I mean, I don't know. I mean, Miami of Ohio already lost to Northwestern, which doesn't look like a particularly great Northwestern team. So again, they look pretty mediocre. However, what I get really interested in is we get to one-loss teams. And with Northern Illinois, their losses to a Notre Dame team that still seems like it could be in the at-large hunt. And Boise State's loss is a close one to a Oregon team that, at this point, I'm expecting a loss, at least one loss. I don't know where, but I'm expecting them to now be an at-large player rather than going to win the whole Big Ten. I really don't feel it.
I just think that there's no way that they can hang against Ohio State. Yeah. Like, with the way that they're playing right now, they're going to get healthier. That's one thing to note, is like, they are really banged up on the offensive line. My issue with them, especially as a title type team, is that I thought they had better offensive line depth than what they're throwing out there right now. But I do think that, one, this was always, I think, an at-large team. I think that this was always, at best, they were going to split potentially a conference title game and the home game against Ohio State. But if they go 11-2, which I think is very much still on the table, like, they're going to be number 6 or 7. So
I think that's the thing. I'm less confident about them being number 5, because they were like penciled in as my number 5 team. And
I think that there's a team down in Austin that might be penciled in at number 5 after this weekend.
So just to kind of close this out, are we keeping Boise State or are we swapping them out?
You vote first. I'm very split.
I'm voting to put in NIU. I'm voting in to give NIU, because I just feel the fact is they both played similarly ranked teams, and NIU actually beat the team they were supposed to beat in similar circumstances.
All right. That's fair. Let's put in NIU. I don't know how long this is going to last. This might last 1 week, to be honest.
Classic. But MAC Sunbelt ranked for 1 week, baby. Although they have a bye, so 2 weeks.
It's 2 weeks. It's 2 weeks. But I mean, even when it comes to them just being in, there is going to be a very interesting game this weekend involving a Group of 5 team that could potentially push them out. That would be, I think, if Memphis goes and beats Florida State on the road, then I think that you're going to have a real conversation about whether Memphis, even if NIU doesn't do anything to lose their spots, maybe Memphis starts to encroach and get in there.
I'm more interested in seeing the reactions in Tallahassee if that happens.
If Mike Norvell loses to his better program, the Memphis Tigers.
Oh my goodness. Like that whole situation is, yeah. So it is funny. Now we're going to literally have Memphis rooting for Florida State to just please get off the mat. Please. get up, Dad. Get up.
Be a quality win for us, please.
Oh my gosh. It's going to be like the Lion King crying, nudging. Please get up, Anyway. All right. So when we get back, we're going to be talking about which team we're going to potentially vote in to join our survivors, as well as get into a bigger discussion about, how we rank our teams' championship hopes here on the College Football Survivor Show.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.
Okay, so we've talked about the teams that were replacing or taking off. I mean, because it was a G5 team, we had to immediately replace them. So Boise State's been swapped with Northern Illinois. We voted off Notre Dame. Now we have one more space for a team to potentially vote on. We pretty much unanimously agreed Oregon is not going to be that team. We put it up to a vote. It was very much swayed towards not allowing the Ducks back on after that Boise State game. I think at this point, I at least think there is a more worthy team. Who is that candidate?
That would be the Volunteers of Tennessee. And we said last week this was going to be a play-in game, Tennessee versus NC State. And one of these teams very much did not play their way in, and that would be the NC State Wolfpack. I do think this game, like the score is crazy, right? The score is crazy, 51-10. This was a game that did kind of just get away from NC State in the second half. I don't think it was like quality-wise this gap necessarily, but there were two things, just to touch on NC State, because I had them as my number 2 in the ACC. I still think they're in reasonable shape. There are two things that I think really concern me. They could not hang at all in the trenches against Tennessee's defensive line. That was actually the bigger issue. People are going to look at 51 and think this was a huge oh my gosh, Nico, he went crazy. Nico kind of wasn't very good in this game. NC State did a pretty good job of keeping him under control. 2 interceptions, only 211 yards on 23 pass attempts. Like, he was okay. But, and also Tennessee, especially in the second half, just wore down NC State's front. Mm-hmm. NC State's front did a good job of holding up in the first half, but they were just on the field for so long that it just became a real disaster for NC State. Yeah, the fact that NC State couldn't hold up on the offensive line is concerning. And Tennessee is a really good defensive front. Like, their defense is actually, I think it's been one of the more underrated units by certainly an SEC team of the past couple of years. And the reason that I say that is, you look at this Joe Milton team from last year, like, they were very inconsistent, but the reason they were able to get to 9 wins was largely on the back of their defense. And I'll tell you what, as somebody who covered a whole lot of offenses like what Tennessee runs out there with their veer and shoot type stuff under Josh Heupel, that's one of the hardest things to do in football, is to also be good on the defensive side of the ball when you're trying to run that level of pace. I mean, they ran 67 offensive plays, but the defense was so good that they held NC State to only 50 such plays, and weren't on the field the whole game because they just managed to turn them over. NC State, I was so excited about the idea of Jordan Waters coming in for NC State. I talked about him all off season. He looked great in week 1 for whatever that's worth. He rushed for negative yardage in this game. They just could not block anybody or anything.
Yeah, I think the Wolfpack offense got 143 total yards and only 27 of them that second half. As you said, they wore them down. I mean, we knew James Pierce was a phenomenal athlete on that line, but that entire defensive line, I mean, they had more tackles for loss, 13, than NC State had first downs, 10. So
not great. I do think this makes me concerned for the Clemson game for NC State on September 21st. It makes me concerned for the Northern Illinois game on September 28th. But other than that, I'm not like out on this team by any means. Like I think that they're still going to be pretty good in the ACC. But I said this was a huge game for the ACC because it could potentially open up a second playoff spot for them as an at-large. I don't think that that's going to happen now. I don't see, unless Clemson really just like sets the world on fire from here. Like that, which is a possibility. That's definitely a possibility after what they did to App State last week. If Clemson goes through and let's say finishes 11-2 or 12-1, I think that they're still in very good shape. And it turns out playing Bryant Wesco, the 5-star wide receiver, might have been a good idea in week 1 as well against Georgia. But, to each their own, to each their own. But I think that now that's really the only pathway is Miami and Clemson being the two teams competing from the ACC. I think that there is very little margin for error otherwise. But anyway, I talked way too long about NC State when we really should be talking about Tennessee. This is a complete football team right now. Like they look as good as just about anybody in college football. And it didn't come down to the quarterback, like we mentioned. Nico Iamaleava did not play all that well in this game, but they dominated on the ground. They dominated in the trenches. They dominated up front defensively. They dominated on the back end defensively. They have more pathways to winning games than I thought that they did. And the fact that they were able to really kind of overcome a slow offensive start in some ways against a really good defense and still dominate this game, that makes me really excited. The thing that complicates things is that I believe that Tennessee gets both Alabama and Georgia this year. So that'll be fun to see whether they can handle those games. But I mean, look, a 10-2 Tennessee team with losses to those two teams still gets in, right? Like they're still in really good shape. I said before the year, by the way, too, that to me, the week 4 game between Tennessee and Oklahoma was going to reveal one contender. I don't think we have to wait for that game right about now. I think Tennessee is just going to be that team. They look like they're going to go into Stillwater, or oh my gosh, into Norman, Norman. That one, I know which team. They're going to go into Norman and potentially give them a whole lot of.
I think we should just go to Stillwater, catch the Cowboys completely by surprise. Like, wait, why are you guys here? We're supposed to.
This is a lot flatter than I thought it would be.
Yeah, I have to say, though, I completely agree with you that the big question was, when we get to that Oklahoma, because they're the welcoming committee, as we talked about for Oklahoma. Their first SEC game is going to be hosting the Vols. After that Houston game where Oklahoma literally escaped 16-12, I'm not sure if Willie Fritz is looking good. Because, I mean, the previous week, UNLV, who we were just talking about, had defeated Houston, but now suddenly Houston goes in. I love these first few weeks. I really can't tell who's strong, who's weak, who's what, but at this point, Tennessee looks strong enough that I'm not worried about that Oklahoma game. They have a Kent State in between, not worried about that as well. At Arkansas, who knows? Because Arkansas, we probably won't get a chance to really talk about that Oklahoma State game, but yeah, I honestly can't tell what's going to happen there. They really don't get a serious challenge until the third Saturday in October against Alabama. That's going to be an absolutely exciting one to see. But all of that said, we pretty much unanimously agree Tennessee's got to be part of this conversation moving forward. We're going to put them on the island.
Yeah, that's a pretty easy call. The voters as well were right there with us. I believe it was 70% of the voters said yes, Tennessee is in the field. So congratulations. We've got yet another team from the Southeastern Conference in the field. One thing I'll mention is that 6 of the top 7 teams in the AP Top 25 this week are from the SEC. 6 of the top 7. These teams will play each other. Some will reveal some issues. Some will lose some games. Mathematically, it's probably not going to be 6 of the top 12 in the college football playoff. But the Big Ten has not exactly covered itself in glory so far this season. The ACC isn't exactly cranking out contenders. Probably the biggest thing to happen for the Big 12 this past week was that Oklahoma State and Kansas State avoided some real screw-ups. Oklahoma State went down 21-0 against Arkansas, managed to come back in a game that they really should not have won. And Kansas State came back against Tulane. That's going to be – Oklahoma actually plays Tulane next week. We'll kind of have to wait and see whether they're able to cause some trouble. But Yeah,
One
the
concern I
SEC is-
have, though, I have for the Big 12 is, do we know the condition? Because we're recording this right now, Monday afternoon.
Yes.
Cam
yes,
Rising,
yes.
I mean, Kyle Whittingham said the injury wasn't that bad, but he's not a doctor. I never trust the coach until I hear what happens. And with the history of Cam Rising, I mean, he left. He didn't play the second half against Baylor. What's the condition of Rising? Because that's going to really determine that team's success in my mind.
So I was texting actually some media members out in Utah because I wanted to know two things. First of all, where the hell is Sam Heward? And the answer is fourth string on the depth chart. Not great. The fact that he has played that poorly since arriving. And he is working under the disadvantage of he didn't go through spring. He doesn't know the playbook like some of these other guys do. Sometimes these players are good practice players and they obviously just don't have the goods when you get to Saturday. But the fact that you're throwing a true freshman, Isaac Wilson, out there as the primary backup, and potentially have him playing behind Brandon Rose, who's played for Utah and not well when he's played. Not the greatest. It actually, I feel like, does change my valuation of this Utah team that they don't actually have a good backup. And, to talk about Cam Rising's injury, though. So what they said, it's a hand injury. It's on his throwing hand. I know that during the game, his middle two fingers got taped together. So I assume it's one of those two fingers. They said that he might not play this week, but they would be pretty surprised if he doesn't play the next week after that. So he should be back for the start of Big 12 play. But I mean, I'll tell you what. Hey, maybe my Baylor Bears are just incredible on defense now, but they didn't score any points after Cam Rising went out.
No.
And most teams are going to be able to score at least some points after a team scores 0 points.
Well, the good news is the next team's Utah State, who couldn't score any points again.
Well, but I don't think that you're thinking hard enough. The starting quarterback at Utah State this week could be the revenge of the pig farmer, Bryson Barnes, the starting quarterback. He would love
as a USC alum, I duly noted it was the same quarterback who beat USC last year for the last season. I'm pretty sure the entire team the entire defense remembered who he was.
I will throw out there. I don't think Utah State is very good at just about anything. I think they might be in for a very bad time against their in-state rival. And also, Bryson Barnes did in fact lose the starting quarterback job to Spencer Petras, the former Iowa quarterback. He's the starting quarterback there and then suffered an injury, and that's the only reason that Bryson Barnes is playing. So, not the greatest vote of confidence necessarily.
Yeah, I'm just going to insert one quick comment about the third FBS Utah team, because BYU put the dark horse dreams of SMU They sent them off to the glue factory. That dark horse is gone. SMU, this is going to be a rough first season for them. That probably, yeah. I mean, they could theoretically win the ACC, because gosh knows that conference.
That is a hell of a hypothetical. Well, I'll tell you what. You know what game has lost every little bit of luster that there could have possibly been? I would not like to be in the ticket office right now at SMU trying to sell SMU Florida State tickets, because that was going to be a marquee game that could have gotten SMU into the top 25 and set them up as a legit ACC contender. And now this game is a mid-off. It will be so bad. And by the way, SMU plays TCU before this, and TCU hasn't looked amazing, but has certainly looked better than this.
Better.
They have a chance to start their tenure as a power conference team 2-2 with a game that they should have lost to Nevada on the schedule, and the only other win coming against Houston Christian University, a team with a CVS and its football stadium.
Yeah, no, I know. It's a FCS program formerly known as Houston Baptist. When you have to say formerly known as, I mean, granted, UNLV beat Dixie. Well, pardon me, Utah Tech, the school formerly known as Dixie State.
Have some respect.
Yeah, but yeah, oh my goodness. Well,
yeah, no more Houston Baptist versus Dixie State. Now it's Houston Christian versus Utah Tech.
All right. Well, we should probably then shift gears. Let's go ahead and we wanted to just close out this episode with kind of ranking our 12 teams based on pure championship ability. And I think, like a lot of folks, there's basically two kind of groups here. There's the top three, and then kind of whoever the heck we think will fill out the rest. Lead us off, Shehan. Who's your number one team right now?
My number one team is still Georgia. They completely flattened Clemson 2 weeks ago, and that game looks more impressive, actually, than it maybe did before. And I think that they're still the team to beat. In fact, when you look at the other contenders in college football, one of the other teams that we're going to talk about has looked really good too. But I think that Georgia they just beat you in so many ways. They have a level of depth that I think is unmatched in college football right now, really at every position group. I mean, they're the type of program that if they lost one or two key playmakers, I just don't even think it matters, right? Like that's the level that Georgia is working with in college football right now. So I have them still as my number one.
I think that's a great call. I think this Clemson team almost feels like the Ducks 2 years ago, where they went and really got embarrassed by Georgia, only to go on and look great for the rest of the season.
Yeah.
Like, is that the type of Clemson team? And this is a season where that will absolutely get you, as you said, that makes them still very much alive to be in the playoffs. So
100%.
we could see a potential return in the match, or at the very least, both of them end up in that final 12 team, which. I mean, again, not only did it put kind of App State's dreams of being a G5 champ kind of to bed, but it really just underlined how good this Georgia team looks. I agree. I'm unanimous on that one. It's hard to doubt Georgia at this point. Really, the bigger question is, because I mean, the next two teams are almost in some ways interchangeable, but I mean, I'll go ahead and say mine. I think it's Texas, just because they have a better resume builder by out muscling Michigan. I mean, that game at Michigan was they dominated really both sides. They snapped obviously a 16-game winning streak that we all expected to be snapped sometime this season. But the fact is, Texas just looked great. Quinn Ewers just had an excellent game out there. He's really good in big games. I mean, we knew that last year against Alabama.
Yeah,
and obviously,
see that's the thing. I've watched him a lot in big games. I've also watched him a lot in small games, which is why I've been a little more inconsistent, like, of my evaluation of him. But through 2 games, he has been locked in. He has looked like the best quarterback in college football through 2 weeks. We'll kind of have to wait and see what the evaluators say. But like, there's a case I think that he's rising up to be like in the conversation for the number 1 overall pick in the NFL draft. It's 2 games. I don't want to already get to that point, but the 2 things that I wanted to see from him are playmaking on third down and red zone. And in game 1, he was incredible in the red zone. In game 2, he was a huge playmaker on third down. You knew that these were passing downs. They knew that he was dropping back, and his stats on third down were just incredible. He threw 2 touchdowns that were both on third down. That's crazy. And this is a Michigan team that is good defensively. Like, we know that. They have a lot back from last season. Their offense is a disaster. We knew that going in. I thought that they wouldn't get into the end zone, and you know what? I still feel like I was pretty much right about that. They got like a garbage time touchdown. That does not count. But I think that to have as much ease moving down the field against this Michigan defense as they did, that says to me, okay, this is a legitimate national championship team. I'm still a little worried about the running backs. If CJ Baxter was still healthy, I think that there's a better case for them to be number 1. They didn't run the ball incredibly well against Michigan, but they didn't really need to either because of how well they were passing the ball. I feel like maybe you want to still move another position player over to running back just to give you another body, but I don't think that that's a fatal flaw, especially this early in the season. And the other piece too, you got to throw out there. One of these teams between 2 and 3 has beaten Michigan in the 2020s. So you know what? That gets you higher on the list.
Which brings us to the third team, the Ohio State Buckeyes. I think the bigger concern here isn't that they're not bad. They just haven't really been able to get challenged all that much. The biggest story you could say is Jeremiah Smith is getting attention, and the fact that Chip Kelly is really having some fun with that running game. I mean, Quinshon Judkins and Trayvon Henderson were combined for 4 touchdowns and were averaging 9.2 yards per carry in their last win. But beyond that, they still haven't been challenged. I don't think they mind because I think they're still kind of also, I mean, Akron and Western Michigan, and they got Marshall coming up. They're still just sort of breaking into this Chip Kelly offense. So I think it works out well for the Buckeyes because, I mean, their first real challenge will be in a couple of weeks. Against, actually, no, they have a bye. And then in 3 weeks from now, they're going to be at Michigan State. That'll be the first, I'm not going to say the toughest challenge, but it'll be enough of a challenge that we'll get a better barometer of where the Buckeyes are right now. Because right now they seem fine, but they just haven't challenged themselves enough for us to really evaluate them. But I still feel confident that they are absolutely one of the top 3 championship caliber teams.
Oh, there's no question. Like there's nothing to truly be concerned about with this Ohio State team at this point. I thought that Will Howard was a little more efficient in game 2 than he was in game 1. Just and some of this is just timing with wide receivers, right? Like obviously in that first game, you're throwing a lot of passes to a guy who's never played college football before, and he's starting to trying to figure things out a little bit. I thought week 2 they did a good job of keeping the game pretty easy and just playing well. But the thing I love about this Ohio State team versus the last couple is like the passing game only needs to be pretty good because everything else is so good. You mentioned, of course, the dynamic running game that they bring to the table. I think that they are just so much more diverse in the running game with Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins. That's just an unfair backfield of 2 guys who bring slightly different looks to the table. I think the other thing that you mentioned is like this Ohio State team is fascinating because if they win a national title, yes, it'll be because they're good on offense. But their defense is like the best unit that they have right now. And that's not a shot at the offense. That is a credit to the defense. They held Western Michigan to 99 total yards, 0.9 yards per carry. Like that'll do all right. 2.1 yards per play. That'll do, man. And some of this has to be projection because we won't really know anything about this team until they play Iowa. We'll learn some stuff about their offense probably, but not a lot about their defense. The next week they play Oregon, which certainly is going to be one of the biggest games of the year. And so we'll learn a lot about them when they go on the road and how they handle that moment. But like, there's not many teams on their schedule that I expect to challenge them. And that's a great position for them to be in.
It absolutely is. And just one last note before we move off of Ohio State, because we are slowly following Kyle McCord. And we probably won't get a chance to, because that was the game I was looking at. That was the game I said, like, if outside chance could have relevancy. Yours was that Texas State UTSA game, which Texas State handled all kinds of business.
Yeah, by the way, another team that we probably should at least throw into the idea of being in the G5 conversation as well. If they go 13-0, and by the way, they play a really good Arizona State team coming up. Like Thursday. Arizona State is starting to figure some things out. And, one thing that Texas State didn't have that a lot of the other contenders did was that marquee power conference opponent. Now, Arizona State is not Notre Dame, right? Like, I'm not comparing that. But I think it is a quality enough win with the way that Arizona State has played their first 2 weeks of the year, absolutely crushing Wyoming, and then absolutely crushing Mississippi State, that if Texas State wins that game and then goes 13-0 or 12-1 even, I think that they're going to also be right there with Boise State, with Northern Illinois, with Memphis, and potentially a host of other teams, UNLV also maybe being in that role.
Absolutely. So just a quick note, because again, we said that Georgia Tech Syracuse game could set up some interesting dynamics for the ACC should they ever hope to get a second team in, which seems more and more distant. Kyle McCord, I just have to give him some credit. He had the game of his life, going for 381 yards, 4 touchdowns in a 31-28 battle that took down number 23 Georgia Tech in the Dome. So again, sometimes you just work better in a different system. The wonderful world of being able to just transfer this way. I'm glad for some of these players.
Sometimes it is just like it. I mean, on the other sideline, you kind of get this too with Haynes King. Sometimes it's just that like all this day-to-day, minute-to-minute pressure, it's a lot. These are young kids. Like these are 20, 18 to 22-year-olds, well, to 25-year-olds in some case, but like these are young kids, and everybody knew that Kyle McCord had to step in and be as good as CJ Stroud from day one, and he couldn't do it. That doesn't mean that he wasn't capable of ever being that player. And you did say, oh, this was the game of his life. Actually, second time in 2 weeks that he's had 350 yards and 4 touchdowns. So this is actually just his new life.
It's fascinating too. One thing that I don't want to overlook about Syracuse is they held the Yellow Jackets to 112 yards rushing. So,
wow.
and it was billboard material because, Brent Key went into it saying like they're not really physical, and the Orange noticed. Sometimes you squeeze the Orange, sometimes the Orange squeezes you. That's all I can say about that.
The good news is I think that they play they're off this week, and then they play on Thursday. A classic ACC rivalry, Stanford versus Syracuse.
Oh my gosh. I kind of love this chaos just this season. Some people are upset. I'm kind of loving the novelty of it. I can't get enough of it. Wait, what?
This is actually kind of funny. Again, sorry, not to touch on Syracuse for too long because we're trying to rank our playoff contenders, but they play versus Stanford at home. They play at UNLV, so they're crossing west for that game, for a non-conference game. And then they play at Cal later in the year as well. So they're going west twice and also playing Stanford at home, in addition to playing in Boston and in addition to playing in Raleigh. Like, this is insane. Theirs isn't too bad, but the fact that they have 2 West Coast trips, Western United States. I know that Las Vegas isn't on the coast, but the fact they have 2 West Coast trips, then also finish against the U at home, like it's so wild.
Credit to Cal for getting the ACC another win over the SEC. That's all I got to say. I mean, again, we live in a weird times. So I cannot wait for that Cal to Florida State trip. That's all I got to say.
I cannot believe that Hugh Freeze lost to the liberal agenda.
Oh my goodness. Well, okay, so we've got our first 3 teams ranked as pure championship ability. Now we get into kind of the mushy area. I'll let you start here. I mean, who did you put as kind of your 4th team here as likely to just get into the championship and take it all based on who they have and what they are doing?
Yeah, so and I view this as being a little different than just creating rankings. I think that it's also got to factor in depth a little bit. It's got to factor in matchups a little bit. For that reason, I'm going to overreact, and I'm going to put Tennessee at number 4. And the reason that I say that is because I think that this Tennessee team I think that they just have more pathways to winning than almost anybody else. They can win with their defense. They can win with their defensive front. They can win with their offensive line. They can win running the ball. I think that when it's time to go to work, they're going to be able to certainly win with Nico Iamaleava. Mm-hmm. And I just think that this is a really well-coached team that has no business being as talented as it is, frankly. And so to me, there's kind of a true second tier in our list of true contenders. I'm going to put Tennessee just half a step at the top.
It's interesting because I had this same kind of internal discussion over who my next SEC team was going to be. And I ended up putting a team between them, but we'll get to them in a second. So my next up was Ole Miss. But the problem with Ole Miss is they haven't really played anybody. Furman and Middle Tennessee State are not quite opponents, but they have done exactly what they're supposed to do and just absolutely crushed them. 128-3 in total score here with 1,400 yards. Jackson Dart, what he completed like an SEC record 24 consecutive passes before throwing in completions in the 4th quarter against Middle Tennessee. So Henry Parrish, who of course they brought back from Miami to replace Quinshon Judkins, has looked good in his performances out there. Not really worried about their game against Wake Forest or Georgia Southern or at this point Kentucky. So they're not going to really get challenged.
Terrible.
They're not going to be challenged until at best October, and it depends how early in October. Depends how much credit you give to South Carolina.
Well, this is the thing. Is like, if we're talking about a title contender, right? If we're talking about being proven to be like a legit title contender, will we know anything before November 9th? Like anything, they play Georgia on November 9th. But here's just quickly rundown of their schedule: at Wake Forest, CW game. So who knows? Georgia Southern, Kentucky, at South Carolina. I think we'll learn something about their offense in the South Carolina game. At LSU versus Oklahoma. Both those teams have looked terrible. At Arkansas. And then you finally get to Georgia. And by the way, then you finish with at Florida and versus Mississippi State. Like, if they don't beat every other team on their schedule by multiple touchdowns until they get to Georgia, like I don't think we're going to know anything about this team.
No, I think that's a big part of it. But and again, we're early enough in this season that at this point I just like who they've brought in, and they seem to all be meshing. I mean, we know they brought in like Walter Nolan to anchor that defense. They brought in some great talent. I just think at this point I'm willing to go with Ole Miss only because maybe I'm a little more nervous at just the flaw I see with Tennessee isn't the defense. The flaw I see is when they get in the SEC play, Nico, who made a couple of bad interceptions, is going to make a couple more. And that's, by the way, that's okay. That's okay. We thought Tennessee was going to look even more ferocious next season. And I think that might be where they kind of fall back to where we thought they were going to be an at-large contender, but not necessarily a championship contender. And at this point, I'm going with a little bit more of the established Ole Miss in this particular question, which goes on to my next team, my number 5. And again, this is where I decided to say, like, you know what? I think I like who they have. I think they're totally loaded, and they're like the only banner carrier for the ACC. And I went with the U. I went with Miami because they're also doing what they're supposed to be doing. They beat up Florida. Then they went and crushed Florida A&M. Not a whole lot you need Reed run that, but Cam Ward is looking great. He's the first Miami player with putting up numbers that that he has since 2017. They've got obviously Xavier Restrepo is clicking well in that offense, like he already was, but I mean really well with Cam Ward. That defense has been solid. I mean, at this point, I think Miami. And I don't think they mind the fact that they're kind of like everyone's paying attention to the chaos around them. They did what they needed to do in that week 1, and now they're a contender. And people are not going to pay attention to Miami, I think, for a few more weeks at the very least. But I think I'm going with the U at this point.
I had them ahead of Ole Miss at my number 5 and Ole Miss number 6. And there's a couple pieces for that. One, I think that their pathway to being a high seed helps, right? I think that they're going to be the 3 seed as it looks right now in the college football playoff, which means that they'll get a bye. I think that, to me, right now, I feel like their high-end talent, especially on offense, is better than what Ole Miss has. Ole Miss has some really good players, so they probably have a better depth of talent. But I think that Miami's high end gives them just a little bit more. I just think that, look, I might be underselling Jackson Dart, but I think that Cam Ward is like a Heisman type player at quarterback. I think that he is like a game changing level player that potentially could make them really special. So they're really close. I had them behind Tennessee because I think Tennessee just has a little more depth, a few more pathways than Miami does. But I think that Miami matches up very well with what Ole Miss brings to the table. And I'll jump to my number 7 real quick too, because I think that this is a tier for me, is this 4 through 7. I have Alabama number 7. And the reason that I have a separation between 7 and 8 is because I think that these are the teams that might be able to put together the depth to win a national championship. Once I get to 8, it's a little more difficult for me to see that. But Alabama did not look good again against South Florida. They did not look good. They're very lucky that they pulled away at the end so that people didn't notice who weren't watching the game, because the scoreboard looked okay. I think it ended up like 42-16. This was a game well into the 4th quarter. And maybe South Florida just has some things that present some matchup issues, especially against Alabama's offensive line. But that's not what exactly I wanted to see from Alabama heading into a really big season for Kalen DeBoer. So I have them 7. They're still really talented. I have every faith, frankly, that they're going to figure it out. And the explosiveness that they have, I think, gives them a floor that other teams don't have. But right now, they're at the back of my okay, these teams might have depth to win a title.
Yeah, so just to kind of run myself up to where you're at. So I had Ole Miss as number 4, Miami number 5, Tennessee number 6 for very similar. We've already kind of parsed out my reasoning for that, but similar kind of ordering with Miami in between. I debated about where to put Alabama. I put them at number 8 because again, I was a little concerned about what I saw against South Florida. I mean, it looked like they had a lot of penalties. I don't like the way a lot of the problems they had for the depth of SEC play. I could see other coaches taking advantage of that. I mean, USF does a lot with a little. So we've talked a lot about the talent they have, that quarterback and Alex Golish's entire team. But I put one team, and I know this one feels a little more reactionary because it was the latest game on Saturday night. But holy cow, if you've watched USC for a second, suddenly they look like an old USC team. I mean, they already did against LSU, but I needed to see at least one more game from LSU. LSU did what they were supposed to do and beat up an FCS team with no problem. So that a little more confidence in USC from that game. But usually USC has played down to their opponents, and instead they did the opposite and handled Utah State 48-0, despite the fact the power in the Coliseum is apparently held together with scotch tape because it kept losing power in the middle of the game and delaying it further and further into the night. Not that I'm bitter about staying up that late in Central Time Zone, but again, they were able to establish that run. They had almost 250 yards on the ground. Miller Moss is looking good. The defense, though, I mean, again, Danton Lynn, I think I saw a USC fan write Danton win. It's just like, it is unreal to see their first shutout since 2011. I remember that. That was that infamous USC UCLA game where UCLA still went on to the Pac-12 championship because USC was not allowed to play in it. But I mean, again, I think I'm a little more confident in this USC team. I'm cautious. That's why I'm still putting them in the lower end of this 12-team ranking, but a little bit ahead of Alabama, only because I think suddenly I'm not as worried about how they're going to do in that particular Big Ten because they don't play. They get to go play at Michigan. Not really worried about the game quite as much as I used to be, although it still will absolutely be a test. But I think, again, when we're looking at the bottom half of this, they're kind of teams where like they could get it together. And at this point, USC's not done anything that makes me worried about them getting it together. They're playing eerily competent. And then I had Alabama at number 8. For number 9, who did you go with? Or
Yeah,
actually, who do you have for number 8?
Yeah,
who do you have
for number 8, I have Penn State because I think that I think that they just have a little more depth of talent on defense, especially at this point. I have USC at 9. They're real close. I think that they're right next to each other. I think that if they were to play against each other next week, I might lean USC. But I think that Penn State, like, they've just built up talent, I think, over a longer period of time. I think that USC is a little more dependent on individual players at this point. I think of like an Anthony Lucas. The way that he's been playing on defense is incredible. If he were to miss a half, right? Like, I think that changes USC completely in a way that I don't think that Penn State is as dependent necessarily on individual players. And I will say, though, they made me look real dumb because I was extremely excited about them last week, and then they go and put up this stinker against Bowling Green. Not what I was hoping to see from them, but I still think that Penn State, I think that they're still in good shape. And I still like some of the stuff that I've seen from their offense. I imagine that they went pretty vanilla in that game against Bowling Green. I wasn't watching it closely, but
their defense is what didn't seem to make as much. They just were having a bad day.
Yeah.
They weren't tackling quite as well. They weren't getting the pass rush quite where they needed to. Aller was still pretty solid. It wasn't the offense. It was clearly the defense just didn't. I mean, granted, they still had to come from behind, but halftime adjustments, which good coaches do. They went from they were able to hold that Bowling Green offense only 3 points in the second half and come from behind victory over the Falcons. My goodness, Mac, what are you up to? It's the return of the Mac. Here they are. Oh, there it is. So, as we kind of close out our rankings here, we don't have to spend too much time on them. How did you finish it out?
Yeah, let me just run through my bottom 3 quickly. I have Missouri at 10. I think that they're still just in really good shape. I think that they're still a good team. I know that Luther Burden went out with an injury for a little bit over the weekend, but I think he's supposed to be all right. Somebody correct me on that if not. But Utah at 11 actually has a lot to do with the Cameron Rising issue. Not because I think he's going to be out. I think he's going to be fine. But more because if he's out, I do not like what I've seen so far from what they have behind him. Isaac Wilson is not ready to lead a college football playoff team. The fact that Sam Heward is a non-factor, hugely concerning to me. I just don't feel great if that's the case. I still think that they're in good shape to win the Big 12, but I do not see them as a playoff team if there's any because again, if Cameron Rising's been hurt a lot in his career, and if he's not, if you have to worry at all about that, like that's the difference between a 13-win team and like a 9-win team.
I just want to go ahead and say I did check. Burden was out with an illness. He was apparently feeling sick.
Okay.
So that's a little more optimistic. It wasn't like a physical injury. He wasn't feeling well.
That's good. I assumed it was no big deal, but you just never know with these things. And obviously NIU at number 12.
Gosh, now I'm embarrassed. So I closed it out with Mizzou is number 9, Penn State is number 10, only because I was a little more concerned about, can they kind of focus a little bit more. And Utah was an easy number 11, only because again, that seems to live or die on Cam Rising. Now the G5 is number 12, but honestly, okay, if I had to pick, NIU wouldn't be the team I would expect if they were to make it to actually be a championship run. I would expect it to be a Boise State or perhaps a UNLV. If I were to pick 2 G5s, those would be the two where, from what I've seen so far, you throw them in there, I could see them potentially doing something. Boise State, you have done the most that we've seen, but at this point, I'm more nervous about who else you're facing in that conference. But yeah, if NIU does make it, I don't know. Maybe I'm not as... That's the awkwardness. It's talking about pure championship ability versus who should be based on what they've done immediately. I love it. My goodness, what a wide-ranging discussion here. Well, it's so funny too. I was ranking my G5 at NIU, Boise State, UNLV, Texas State, and my $1 Price is Right bid, Liberty, who nearly got eliminated by New Mexico State, but dang it, they somehow hang on. I don't know how. They're the cat that came back. Yeah, they found a way. Well, it's been a long show. We're going to go ahead and wrap this up. I want to thank all of you for listening to us. Thank our producer, Joey Aliberti. Be sure, if you can, to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on X and TikTok at CFB Survivor Show. He's Shehan J. Raja. You can find his work at cbssports.com and at Shehan J. Raja at X and TikTok. I'm Bobak Irie, part of the group that runs Reddit CFB. Thanks for listening.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.